Hi everybody, this is Francisco Gil-White for Management of Reality and Arutz Tov in our joint programming. And today I have with me Einat Wilf, who is a former member of the Knesset and an author. And she was close to Shimon Peres in the whole process that was behind the signature of the Oslo Accords. So I think she's someone very interesting to talk to. I have some questions about that entire process and her own journey. Einat Wilf, thank you very much for joining us.
Certainly.
I'd like to ask you first. It is my understanding from what I've heard in interviews that you've participated in that you have traveled a pretty far distance from the left to what is usually called the right in Israel, in the sense that you once used to believe in the Oslo process, and apparently you no longer believe in the Oslo process at all. So I'm interested to know, first of all, what was your relationship to the Oslo process originally, and what made you change your mind? How did you travel from one position to another? Tell us a little bit about your personal process.
So first, just to kind of set a few issues. In the 90s, I'm still an observer, a very enthusiastic one, of the various negotiations and the Oslo process. I worked with Shimon Peres later in the early 2000s. For example, I worked with him during the process of the disengagement from Gaza. But in terms of the story I tell, what I'll share with you is that over the years, as I've told the story of kind of watching this process, realizing that the assumption we had that what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state, that collapsed completely. Some people have said what you just said. They said things like, oh, you've moved from the left to the right, or you've changed an opinion. And I've been very clear in telling people that when I realized that people began to think that this is a matter of opinion, I told them that it's not an opinion. I want to make the case that this is empirical. And I like to describe the process as an empirical process. And I describe it like this. We had a hypothesis. The hypothesis says that what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state or Palestinian control of territory. Now, I want to say two words about how that hypothesis emerged. It had two kind of key elements that created it. The first is the first Intifada, which is now kind of forgotten, but it was my generation's military service. The first Intifada, kind of a much more popular uprising, we saw, for example, the Palestinians, the children using slingshots. So that began for us a kind of question of reverse imagery. If they're using slingshots, are they the David and we're the Goliath? Or, for example, they would use Molotov cocktails. And if you know your Zionist history, then if they're using Molotov cocktails, are we the Syrian tanks and their kibbutz Dgania? So we began to project on them the notion that they were what we were, a people seeking independence, statehood, even if it's in part of the land. And then began the 90s. And again, people sometimes talk about Oslo. How could you have been so naive? And I have to remind people what the 90s were like. The 90s was a decade where everything that people said was impossible happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall came down. The countries of Eastern Europe became free. Nelson Mandela came out of prison. Apartheid in South Africa came to an end. Northern Ireland signed the Good Friday Agreement. Everything that seemed impossible happened, and it even had a name, the end of history. And in that global mood, it became possible to imagine that we, in our little corner of the world, can finally put behind decades of enmity. So that was the background. And what's important here, so we had this hypothesis that what stands between us and peace is Palestinian statehood, partition, Palestinian control of territory. Now comes the part that people love to either ignore or erase, and this is that the hypothesis was tested. And like good scientists, it was repeatedly tested, and I would say that it's important that it was tested. It was tested by two Israeli prime ministers, Ehud Barak in 2000 and Ehud Olmert in 2008. Important to say, prime ministers that were elected on a platform of peace. They did not betray their voters by pursuing it. And both of them, with two different Palestinian leaders, Arafat in 2000, Abu Mazen in 2008, find that even though they propose a fully sovereign state of Palestine, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, no, including holy sites, both of them are rebuffed by two different Palestinian leaders, followed by murderous violence, and even more important is that they are not criticized. There are no dissenting voices among the Palestinians who are saying, go back there into the negotiating room and get us what get us our state. That's what we want. Which shows that in walking away, both Arafat and Abu Mazen were fulfilling their people's wishes. In between Barak and Olmert, you have Ariel Sharon, who tests the hypothesis in a different way. He says, okay, direct bilateral negotiations are not successful. Let's try unilateral retreat, unilateral disengagement. We'll just give Palestinians territory to control, and that will get us to a better place. And he does it to the last square inch, in a typical Sharon fashion, ruthlessly and effectively. And we know what they made of Gaza. They turned the entire strip into a weaponized landscape for the singular purpose of, in their words, liberating Palestine from the river to the sea. So we have at least a decade, if not two, even three, where the hypothesis that what stands between us and peace is Palestinian statehood, partition, Palestinian control of the land is tested in a variety of ways, and it collapses. So again, like good scientists, you ask, okay, the data doesn't fit the hypothesis I had. What hypothesis does fit the data? And here I always tell the story of meeting Palestinians, realizing that to their credit, they've always told us what they wanted. We just didn't listen, or we listened. We thought it was so preposterous. We assumed it was just some bluster or negotiating position. And then I always tell about how in the process of the research that led to the book, The War of Return, I came across a quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. And if you know anything about Bevin, a friend to the Jewish people, he was not. And Bevin goes to the British Parliament in February 47 to explain why Britain failed to carry out the terms of the mandate that unanimously by the League of Nations were to create a Jewish state. And there's no Jewish state, there's a bunch of Arab states, but no Jewish state. So he says the following, he says, His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now this is February 47. There are no settlements, no occupation, no blockade of Gaza, no Ben Gvir, no Smotrich, no Netanyahu, no displacement. If anyone says that the conflict is because Zionism displaced the local Arabs, in February 47, everyone is in place. No one has been displaced. And yet he calls the conflict irreconcilable. And he goes on to say, there are two people, Jews and Arabs in the land. Of course, no one is called a Palestinian at this point. And he says each one of them has a top priority. He says for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. Great. The Jews want to exercise the universal principle of self-determination in their ancestral homeland. And then he goes on to say, and for the Arabs, and these are not any Arabs, these are the Arabs who will later hijack the name Palestine to be known as Palestinians. He says for those Arabs, the top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. He doesn't say that this is a conflict between two groups, each desiring self-determination, and the only question is how to divide the land. He says, as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. Now, this hypothesis explains all the data. And not only does it explain all the data, so scientifically has the biggest explanatory power, if you think that Bevan said it in February 47, it also had the best predictive arc. Basically, what Bevan realized is that the Jews would always say yes to a two-state solution, as they had, provided that one of the two states is the Jewish state, and the Arabs would always say no to a two-state solution, provided one of the states is the Jewish state. So what I tell people is, this is not my opinion. I didn't change opinions. And I would say that in every aspect that matters to me, from secularism to feminism, I am very much a lefty. But all I'm saying is this is simply empirical. This is what the conflict is about. We can have different opinions what to do with this, but we can't have opinions about the fact that this is the conflict.
Okay, so that's a very useful exposition. Thank you very much, Einat. So if I were to very briefly paraphrase what you told us, what the Arab-Palestinian movement demonstrated then by their actions, in your view, according to the evidence of history, is that they are not interested in an Arab-Palestinian state, but in obliterating the possibility of a Jewish state. And so you don't want to call this a change in opinion. You find it more useful to say this is simply, there was a hypothesis that perhaps land was the crux of the problem. And so there was an offer of land. In fact, there were several offers of land. You mentioned three. You mentioned the Ehud Barak offer, you mentioned the Ariel Sharon disengagement, and also Ehud Olmert's offer of Palestinian autonomy and even proto-statehood in the case of the disengagement. And every time either the proposal, the bilateral negotiated proposal was rejected, or in the case of the unilateral disengagement, since it was unilateral, there was nothing for them to reject, it was just given to them. But what they did with that proto-state in Gaza was to turn it into a terrorist infrastructure dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish state through genocide. So this is for you a scientific conclusion. The hypothesis was rejected by the evidence, so you don't have to become a right-winger. You're still on the left. But the question of the possibility of peace with the Arab Palestinians, the hypothesis that this can be done by exchanging land, in your view, is a hypothesis that has been completely rejected by the behavior of Arab Palestinians. Am I summarizing this correctly?
Absolutely. And not just their behavior, their words, and also they were offered full sovereign states, not just autonomy. So they rejected a full sovereign state.
Okay, so I have a question about this. So I'd like to add a little context to the history you've summarized. So in 1947, as you correctly told us, there was a double offer on the table from the United Nations. The proposal to create in Rump Palestine, what remained of the Palestine Mandate, two states, one for the Arab Palestinians, which in fact is the second state offered to the Arab Palestinians, because Transjordan had already been created from the original British Mandate of Palestine territory, and that's an Arab Palestinian state, and that was created on 3/4 of the original Mandate territory that had been set aside for a Jewish homeland. And then what remained, which was only 1/4, was again partitioned, and only 1/2 of that was offered for the Jewish people. So now the Jewish people were getting 1/7 of the original territory promised to them, and the Arabs were being offered a second Arab Palestinian state on top of the first one, which is Transjordan, which became the Kingdom of Jordan. I'd like to add also that when the offer, the 1947 offer by the United Nations was put on the table, The Arab-Palestinian leadership and the Arab leadership more generally didn't simply reject the offer of an Arab-Palestinian state. Azam Pasha, who was the Secretary General of the Arab League and a protege of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Arab-Palestinian movement, this guy Azam Pasha, he gave an interview to the newspaper Akhbar al-Yom in 1947, right before the UN vote, and he said that if the Zionist Jews accepted the UN offer of a state, he said there will be a war of extermination. He said there would be a international jihadi war of extermination, that Muslims would come from everywhere to fight against the Jews to exterminate them and thereby prevent the formation of a Jewish state. And in fact, the War of 1948 was that attempted war of extermination. If you read, for example, Uri Milstein's history of the War of Independence, he documents with great detail that the Arab forces in the War of 1948 took no prisoners. Any prisoner they managed to capture behind their own lines was tortured to death. So much that Israeli soldiers were told to always have a grenade with them, so that if they were trapped behind enemy lines, they could commit suicide to avoid being tortured to death, because torture to death was the policy of the invading Arab armies. So my question to you from this expanded context is, isn't it true that the hypothesis was firmly rejected in 1948, in 1947-48, because they were offered a second Arab-Palestinian state, and they said out loud that they didn't want it, that what they wanted to do was exterminate the Jews in the Middle East, and then they went ahead and they tried to do that. So it seems to me that the hypothesis was roundly refuted in 1947 and 1948. So why would you say that 3 more attempts to give the Arab Palestinians a state were necessary before concluding that they were not interested in a state and were simply interested in committing genocide, when they had already explained this themselves and in fact attempted to do it in 1948?
That's why I gave the background of both the First Intifada and the 90s. When we enter the First Intifada, which is the late 80s, we are already 40 years after 47. These are years that you also need to remember. It's after various Israeli victories. It's after the first peace agreement with Egypt. There is the beginning of a change of view. So this is why I highlighted both the First Intifada and the 90s as an era where everything you thought was reversed. So those were the 2 conditions that created the possibility of trying again. No one denied that this was what happened in 47, 48, but the combination of the First Intifada on the back of Israeli victories, which led Israelis to believe, kind of inspired by Jabotinsky's Iron Wall, that they will finally realize that there's no defeating us, that what they thought in 48, they can no longer think in 88. So the notion was that the passage of time, Israeli victories, the fact that Egypt has removed itself as a key enemy of Israel, plus the First Intifada, plus the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was the main backer of the Palestinians for decades, the fact that America was the hyperpower, the fact that all of the things that people said could not happen, that was an incredibly powerful combination that led many things to believe that now it would be different.
Okay, that doesn't convince me. Let me tell you why. I understand the context that you're mentioning, but between 1948 and 1991, which is the Madrid Peace Conference, when these negotiations actually began, we have the year of 1974. And in the year of 1974, the PLO created a document called the Plan of Phases, in which they said that they would propose negotiations to exchange land for peace to the Israelis in order to get a chunk of the Israeli state, some piece of territory within Israel, from which they could later attempt from that position the annihilation of the state of Israel. So this is actually an idea that came out of Mahmoud Abbas's doctoral thesis in Moscow, because Mahmoud Abbas has always had this idea that proposing peace is the way to divide Israelis right down the middle and weaken them, a false promise of peace. And if they did that and divided the Israelis, then they would be in a better position to destroy them. So given that this is Mahmoud Abbas's ideology and philosophy, and given that the PLO produced this document in 1974, why should anybody expect their promise to negotiate land for peace to be an honest proposal in 1991, given that they had announced this? And also, I should mention, and this is very important, it was explained on the front page of the New York Times, and you can go check it after the interview. In 1979, the New York Times explained on its front page that the Iranian jihadi revolution was a PLO-Fatah operation. Mahmoud Abbas and Yasser Arafat were responsible for training and arming Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas in Lebanese training camps in the 1970s. And once those guerrillas put Khomeini in power in Tehran, they were the first dignitaries, I'm talking about Arafat and Abbas, they were the first dignitaries invited over to celebrate the revolution with Khomeini in Tehran. Khomeini sent an airplane to bring them over to Tehran. They celebrated the revolution. They announced jointly that they would destroy Israel. This is now 1979. And when the Arab reporters asked Mahmoud Abbas what was the strategy for destroying Israel, he referred to the plan of phases, right? So this is all getting discussed within Arabic and the Muslim civilization, that they had this plan to propose peace in order to destroy Israel. PLO Fatah created the jihadi Iranian state because they also helped Khomeini create his infrastructure, right? So they created the jihadi Iranian state that promises to repeat the Shoah in Israel, and jointly announced with Khomeini that they would carry this out according to the plan of phases. This is now 1979. Why would anybody believe, that's one question, why would anybody believe in this context PLO Fatah's promises of peace, number one, and number two, which is even more important, why do you think that the people running Israel didn't explain to Israeli citizens when this was negotiated, when the Oslo Accords were negotiated, that they were bringing the creators of Iran into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state? Because that doesn't sound like a mistake.
So again, I'm walking you through the timeline because you keep going back. The timeline is that, I don't know how old you are, but in the 1980s and into the 1990s, all the things that everyone thought was impossible happened. This is dramatic. People who are young today fail to understand how dramatic was the fall of the Soviet Union and everything that happened in creating a global mood that made it clear that things that we thought possible or impossible now became possible. So, again, the Soviet Union collapses. The day before it collapses, people whose profession was called Sovietologists said it would never happen, and the day after it happened, they said it was inevitable. So again, this is also a moment where the entire kind of expert class that says one thing, history disproves it completely. These things are dramatic. The countries of Eastern Europe become free. People who lived at that time will not forget the images, the fall of the Berlin Wall, again, the Good Friday Agreement for Ireland, Nelson Mandela coming out of prison, apartheid in South Africa coming to an end. All these things were considered impossible, and they happened. The fact that the Soviet Union, which was the backer of the Palestinians, collapsed, the fact that the Palestinians supported Saddam Hussein and a lot of the Arab countries who were angry at them, left them incredibly isolated. The United States was hyperpower America. It was the only game in town. It's not the America that we have today. So in that world where there was a superpower America, everyone appeared weak. There was a sweeping sense of the end of history. Everything that seemed impossible seemed possible. In that moment, people believed that things could be different. Now, you could like it, not like it, be individually convinced, but that's what happened.
Okay, so I perceive a difference between telling Israelis it's possible to make peace with a relatively weak organization that has been defeated, which was the case of PLO Fatah, because basically PLO Fatah had been defeated in 1982 when Menachem Begin invaded Lebanon. By the way, I remember some of these things from my own lived experience because I'm 55, just in case you're still wondering how old I am. So it's one thing to say we can make peace with PLO Fatah if you don't tell them what PLO Fatah is. But it's quite another thing to tell them we are bringing Iran's daddy into militarily strategic territory of Israel. So if Israelis had been told in the period 1991 to 1995, we are going to bring the organization that created Iran, right, into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state, and we think that's possible. We think it's possible to get peace this way and to bring security to Israeli Jews this way. If they had said that and Israelis had accepted it, I could more reasonably find your argument plausible that the change in context in the world had made everybody believe in peace, and that's why this was tried. But the context I see is that the people running Israel did not share with Israeli Jews that they were actually bringing Iran into Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. That was never explained. The other thing that was not explained is that PLO Fatah is descended from the German Nazi final solution. Al-Fatah was created by Haj Amin al-Husseini, who had a leading role not only recruiting thousands of Bosnian Muslims and Kosovo Muslims into giant SS divisions, Heinrich Himmler's SS divisions, that fought that murdered Serbs, Jews, and Roma in the Yugoslav chapter of the Holocaust. But he also participated with Adolf Eichmann in the administration of the death camp system. This is the founding father of the Arab-Palestinian movement and the creator of Al-Fatah, which swallowed the PLO around 1970. So if you had told Israeli Jews in 1991, in spite of the context of, the end of history and all that, if you had told them, we're going to bring into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state an organization descended from the German Nazi final solution and the creator of jihadi Iran, which promises to repeat the final solution in Israel, with all of that information, do you still think Israeli Jews would have supported the Oslo process? Because I remind you, the Oslo II passed by a one-vote margin in the Knesset.
Again, this is beginning to be a bit exhausting. First, the whole Iranian issue, you might genuinely believe it. No one had that discourse, so it's not as if everyone was discussing
I'm happy to send you the article from the New York Times.
Send me that article, but it might be an article. Except for that was not the discourse. No one said that.
But that's the question. That people knew. That's the question. Why didn't anybody say that?
Because I don't think anybody thought that. I'm hearing that from you for the first time. It's not a discourse, and I've been researching. It's not a discourse. The issue about al-Husseini, the issue about the Nazi origins in Arab propaganda of a lot of
So you're saying they didn't know?
No, I'm saying that there are things that are clearly established in research. What you're saying, I would put a question mark on it. All the other things were established. They were known. For example, again, the Nazi origins of Palestinianism, the fact that the Arab propaganda in Arabic had a lot of impact on the movements, those were things that were known. Actually, recently we saw discussions in the government about the Oslo process. And contrary to the later mythology of Paris and Rabin as some kind of peaceniks, if you look at the protocols, you see hard-headed Mapayniks who knew exactly and were saying we are taking a risk. given the opportunity, given the global mood, given the fall of the Soviet Union, it is a risk that we should take carefully, but it was a very different discourse from what you're displaying, as if people knew something and said something else. They said what they knew. They knew who the PLO was. By the way, was not defeated in 1982, merely their heads exiled, far from defeated. And people knew what they were doing, and they thought that in that context, it was a risk worth taking. It is the reason that the country was split over the questions. It's the reason that the process was built as an interim one. It had a lot of assumptions that were proven to not work, such as constructive ambiguity. But the notion that you're trying to paint as if people knew some big conspiracies and they didn't tell it to people, it was all there. And just the global mood was such that ultimately some people thought it was a risk worth taking, and some people thought it was not a risk worth taking. By the way, it's interesting that the Palestinians have never been able to live up to the phased plan, because whenever they could actually sign to get territory, they balked.
Well, it seems to me the Oslo process is the phased plan. They offered peace. They were allowed inside Israel.
No, Oslo doesn't offer that. Oslo doesn't offer that.
PLO Fatah was outside of Israel, and the Oslo process brought them inside. How did they get inside? They got inside by saying that they would negotiate peace in exchange for land. So they got inside Israel by following the plan of phases, and they have used their
by saying that. But whenever they were actually offered land, they always balked.
Well, but
you're right that if it was much less than that, they would agree, because essentially they got it without paying a price in anything that really mattered to them. Recognizing a Jewish state, ending refugeehood, but they didn't have to pay a price. So, yes, they did it without paying a price.
I'm being told that we have to go in that, but I just want to make clear your position on one thing. So, if I understand you correctly, you are saying that the people running Israel, back when the Oslo Accords were negotiated, did inform the Israeli public about PLO Fatah, and yet you are telling me
they didn't need to inform. You're talking as if Israelis landed in Israel in 1998 from a vacation in the Bahamas. People lived in Israel. They knew what the PLO was. They knew what the Fatah was. People served in the military. They knew what was happening. It was not like people told them. I mean, it's just a bizarre discussion. There were Israelis, hardened Israelis, who knew what was going on and thought, at least half of them thought, it was a risk worth taking. But no one is like lying here or telling stories.
Okay, so you say that nobody is lying and nobody is keeping information from the Israeli Jews. But what we saw in this interview, I remind you, is that I claim that PLO Fatah created jihadi Iran, and you told me that you've heard about this for the first time. So I'm going to send you the New York Times article that explained the role of PLO Fatah in the creation of jihadi Iran, the New York Times article that explained this on the front page in 1979, because I believe that establishes...
That doesn't make it reality. I hope you do recognize that. The fact that they trained some people doesn't make the PLO the father of Iran. You know, there were multiple reasons for the revolution. There were multiple reasons that the revolution took over. Your phrasing of it, again, even without it, it's not that anyone didn't know what the PLO was.
So hold on,
Einat. Given changes, people thought that it was a risk worth taking.
Okay, you have argued for using a scientific language, so I will do the same.
Yes.
This is information that you did not have. So you cannot speak with authority about the relationship between PLO Fatah and Iran if this is the first time you learn that PLO Fatah was training Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas in Lebanon in the 1970s and arming them. So if
no, that's not the first time I'm learning of that fact.
Oh.
That's a known fact. The fact that they created Iran, I would argue that that's your interpretation.
Fine, I will be very happy to...
The fact that they trained people Libyans trained people, Lebanese trained people, Syrians trained people. Everybody was training everywhere. That doesn't make them the father of Iran. And your constant phrasing was not one that anyone was considering.
So you're denying, let me just get this on the record. Are you denying that PLO Fatah helped the Iranians create their jihadi terror infrastructure? Are you saying that?
No, I'm just saying that the fact that they helped them. Do you know how many people help me in things and then decide to take credit for everything? I'm saying that if you help someone, it doesn't make you the creator of something.
Okay, so Khomeini was lying when he thanked Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas for making the Iranian Revolution possible. The Iranian people were confused when they received...
he wasn't lying.
Forgive me, just a second. Just a second. The Iranian people were then confused when they received Yasser Arafat in Tehran like the Mahdi, because they thought that the Iranian Revolution had happened thanks to Yasser Arafat. And the newspapers in the West must have been confused when they reported that the PLO had created Iran's jihadi terror infrastructure. All of that was somehow exaggerated or mistaken. Is that your position?
My position is the PLO helped them. Saying that they are the creator of Iran is indeed an exaggeration. That people do ceremonies, that people thank, that doesn't make it the creator.
Communists and it is also
in the Iranian Revolution. Does that make the Iranian secular communists the father of jihadi Iran? No, but they helped bring down the Shah regime. There's a lot of factors that went into making the Iranian regime what it was. Islamist theology, it's not all on PLO, that they trained some of them, the French helped bring back Khomeini, they housed him. Are they the father of the Iranian? There's a lot of people who helped make it happen. It doesn't make one of them the creator.
It is also your position then that the relationship between PLO, Fatah, and Iran was explained to the Israeli citizenry when they were asked to support the Oslo Accords, which passed by one vote?
Again, for the thousandth time, there was no need to explain what the PLO was. Everyone knew that, lived that, and at least half the people decided that it's a risk worth taking.
In other words, everybody listening to us right now already knew that PLO Fatah had played a key role in the creation of jihadi Iran. Is that your position?
Most people listening to us weren't born there. Again, I don't know specifically about Iran if everyone knew everything about the PLO. Did the people know that the PLO was a terrible organization? People were murdered. Their relatives were murdered. They knew that. They knew what the PLO was, and they thought that things had changed with peace, with Egypt, with Iran, by the way, being weakened by a decade of war, and by the fact that the Arabs had turned on some of the Palestinians because of Saddam Hussein and their support for it. By the way, here in 91, you have the Palestinians not supporting Iran, supporting Saddam Hussein. So in all of these things, the idea was that things have changed.
Actually, your recollection of history is mistaken. In the Gulf countries, the Sunni governments were very worried about the Palestinians precisely because they were supporting Iran against Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. This is very well documented. So, and in fact,
equally well documented is that after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the Palestinians supported him, a lot of other countries were very angry with the Palestinians, and they were part of the coalition, the American coalition. These were dramatic things. I understand that you want to tell a singular story divorced from things that might not fit what you'd like to say, but this was true. Many Arab countries were furious at the Palestinians for supporting Saddam Hussein after his invasion of Kuwait, and that left them isolated.
Einat, Wilf, I'm very appreciative of your position, which is a defense of empirical science and the testing of hypotheses. So I will be very happy to discuss this with you further after I have shared the evidence that I think supports the points I've been making. And I look forward to getting your response so that we can have a scientific discussion about what is historical truth and what Israeli citizens were told and weren't told at the key juncture when the Oslo Accords were signed. But now we have
Again, enough with the told or not told. Israelis are not tourists in
fine.
their
I will.
country. We know what we're facing.
Fine, but the question of what Israelis knew is also something that can be investigated scientifically. So I'm looking forward to hearing your responses when I share this evidence with you, and hopefully we can talk again about this at a future opportunity. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hopefully a less exhausting conversation. Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank
This
you.
is Francisco Gil-White for Management of Reality and Arutz Tov. I remind you that you can find all of our materials at managementofreality.com or franciscogilwhite.com. Thank you very much.